And I see we've got a few folks jumping on. Give them a couple of minutes. Thank you so much for being here. Recycle Colorado's rescheduled event because we want to make sure that everybody is healthy and happy and has all the information they need. So we appreciate everyone's flexibility. If you had not already noticed, it should notify you as you join, but we are recording this webinar. We want people to be able to view the material even if they can't be here to ask questions live. I'm going to give it just a few more seconds before I launch into what we're doing here. I think most of the people who are joining know what we're after. That's why they've joined us. So I'm Liz Chapman, pronouns she, her. I am the executive director of Recycle Colorado. Recycle Colorado is a statewide nonprofit serving the whole state of Colorado. We are working to advance circularity in Colorado by improving recycling, composting, and finding more ways to use materials again and again and keep material out of the landfill. We have a number of partners from private businesses to local governments to individuals that join us in this mission. And we're fortunate enough to have the membership of the Ball Corporation who has brought us here today. So the Ball Corporation values sustainability and they have invested many hundreds, if not more than hundreds of thousands of dollars, advancing circularity, improving their material stream, improving their own sustainable footprint, their greenhouse gas reductions. And in the service of that effort, they worked with a company called Eunomia to create a report called the 50 States of Recycling that did an in-depth, it's an update to their 2021 report. And this is an in-depth look at the state of recycling state by state for all materials across the US. And joining us to give us the lowdown on this very in-depth and fascinating report, which I have already stolen slides from in various presentations, is our one and only Megan Lane. Many of you may recognize Megan Lane because she was a board of directors member in Recycle Colorado, as well as serving as our president of Recycle Colorado. She is currently the senior manager of circularity and public affairs for Ball Corporation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Megan.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me, Liz. And thank you all for taking the time to tune in to our 50 States of Recycling Report webinar. So this is something that we covered during the Recycle Colorado Summit in June, but we want to do a deeper dive into the report. So are you guys seeing my screen okay?
Oh, we can see it.
Great, wonderful. Thanks, Callie, appreciate it. So back in 2021, Ball partnered with Eunomia to release the inaugural edition of the 50 States of Recycling Report. And that was really the first of its kind comparable analysis of specific packaging recycling rates on a state-by-state basis using 2018 data. And what we want to do is publish an update to that report, and we released it in December of 2023, where we provide an update of the rankings of state recycling rates, along with the economic, social, environmental impacts of current recycling rates in those states and what it would be under an ideal high-performing recycling scenario. And we actually modeled the outcomes of different policies in this report. And the last thing I'll say is the reason why this is so important is I think a lot of the recycling nerds know on this webinar is that every state measures recycling rates differently. Some states include just single family residential, some states include multifamily or commercial in that rate. And then states also define recycling differently. For example, some states even count waste to energy as recycling. So this is really meant to provide an apples to apples comparison across all 50 states. And so these are the broad material categories that we use in the report. So one thing you'll note is we have the overall recycling rate that does include this broader category of fiber and flexible plastics. And then we have a packaging recycling rate that pulls that out. And the reason why we do that is especially because of cardboard. this essentially material stream will essentially insulate how the rest of the materials are performing. So this FFP category actually accounts for 66% of all the material recycled by weight. And so because cardboard has a higher recycling rate, because it accounts for so much of the stream, it really insulates how the rest of packaging is performing, which you'll see in these subsequent slides. And so that's why we kind of talk about it in two different ways to talk about the recycling rates in these different states. So to dive into the rankings, this is a map of the United States. It's essentially a heat map with FFP included. This is all materials in the recycling stream. So anything kind of below 20% is going to be kind of an orange-red color. Between 20 to 40 is going to be kind of a golden yellow color. And then over 40% is going to be kind of a green-blue color. And then the gradation of the color is tied to how many tons of material is still being lost to landfills that could be recycled in those states today. And not surprisingly, it's very closely tied to population, right? So there's a lot more people in the state of Texas than there is in the state of Montana, for example. So here you'll see we actually have Colorado at a 29% recycling rate, and this includes single family, multifamily, commercial. This is the full recycling stream in the state, looking at all the materials. But then on this next slide, you'll see that that map will change pretty significantly. So when you pull out that FFP category, that's where you see a lot of the states that were in that yellow or even green color transition pretty dramatically into yellow or honestly also that orange color below the 20%. So when you pull out cardboard and flexible plastics, for example, in the state of Colorado, it drops the recycling rate from 29% down to 11% today. And one of the things that we found when you pull out FFP and just look at packaging overall, 9 of the top 10 states with the highest recycling rates have what's called recycling refunds, also known as bottle bills or deposit return systems in place. With the exception in this case being New Jersey. And then you'll also see that in this ranking, Colorado actually dropped from being in the, I think it was like 36%, or rated 36 out of 50 down to 41. So Colorado is now in the bottom 10 for recycling across the country, which we anticipate will change with EPR coming online, but just an important finding from our report. And then looking at beverage container recycling rates across the US, very similar, right? Not surprisingly, states with deposit return systems generally are doing much better than states without them. We found the same sort of trend continued here for states with beverage container deposits have 9 of those top 10 states have those policies in place for recycling. And it's leading to that higher performance. So I'll dive into our impact analysis. One thing I wanted to talk about is we talk about the real recycling rate a lot in the report. And so it's really important to define what that is. So generally, recycling is measured at the point of collection. So when the recycle cart empties the recyclables, that tonnage is then dropped off at the MRF. That is what counts towards the recycling rate for that jurisdiction. But there's a lot of other losses that can occur along the value chain. So there's sorting losses that occur at the MRF. And then you also have processing losses that occur when that material gets to that processor, whether it's PET that has to be flaked, washed, and repelletized, or in the case of aluminum where it needs to be remelted down. So we essentially count the real recycling rate after the processing losses have occurred. And then we also in the report talk about both the closed loop recycling rate and non-closed loop recycling, but both of those recycling rates count as the real recycling rate. So these two graphs essentially look at material loss rates under different collection modalities. And so this shows how different materials will have different recycling rates or real recycling rates in a MRF system. So the purple is the real recycling rate. Processing losses are in orange. Sorting losses are in pink. And then you kind of have this landfill cover, which really just applies to the glass in the lighter orange color. And you'll see that the real recycling rate varies significantly, right? So ferrous cans, the steel cans, if 100 steel cans go into the MRF, you can essentially assume, or collected for recycling, you can essentially assume that 93 of those 100 will actually be recycled. Whereas with PET other rigid, which would apply to thermoforms, for example, that drops down to 32. And a lot of that is tied to markets and things and what actually happens to that material after it's actually sorted at the recycling facility. In the case of glass, for example, when you take out, alternative daily cover, aggregate, glass being used as aggregate, so whether that's road-based, sandblasting, and other things, it actually drops down across the US down to about 38 of those 100 glass bottles that are collected being really recycled. But then when you look at, recycling refund system where you have that deposit system in place and that drop-off infrastructure, that changes pretty dramatically. So for glass, which is also the last bar over here, it's 96 of those 100 bottles that's collected is really recycled. And so thinking about the different collection modalities we have in the recycling system, how the material is processed, how different materials actually also are processed really impacts what's actually recycled at the end of the day into a new product. The other thing that we want to try to do here is talk about the value that recycling provides and how that varies so much from material to material. And so this talks about the material value that's actually captured within the economy and how it's processed through a single stream system. So for PET bottles, only 49% of the total value of the PET bottles that are collected is actually preserved. 13% is lost to sorting losses, 12% through processing losses, 8% is lost to non-circular packaging, and then 17% is essentially going towards textiles, carpeting, and things like that, which isn't the highest and best use necessarily of that product. And then we'll start diving into closed loop recycling here. So closed loop recycling, the way we talk about in the report, is enabling that material to stay in the economy and to stay in that loop versus being open loop recycled into something else. So bottle to bottle and can to can recycling is probably the most easiest way to describe that. So currently less than 20% of all packaging waste in the United States is currently recycled in a closed loop. And we wanted to compare that with states with recycling refunds compared to states that do not have those policies in place. So for overall packaging, closed loop recycling and states with recycling refunds is 34% compared to non-RR states is only 7%. And when we look at beverage containers specifically, closed loop recycling rates for beverage containers in states with recycling refunds is 49%, and non-RR states is still 7%. And then talking about the 9, so we talked about that 9 of the top 10 states across the United States have recycling refunds in place. Of the 10 states that have recycling refunds, they only account for 27% of the US population, but they account for 47% of all packaging that's recycled nationally, 50% of all the material value that's captured from recycling nationally, 51% of all beverage containers, glass bottles, and aluminum cans recycled nationally, 60% of all PET bottles recycled nationally, and 66% of all beverage containers recycled in a closed loop nationally is coming from these states. So it's really states with these recycling refund policies that are really bolstering the US recycling system as it exists today. And so we thought it'd be really important, recognizing that many of these states with recycling refunds, many of them are in decline because they've not been modernized since the 70s and 80s. That's a really important call out. And so if we talk about what do these high performing recycling refund systems look like, these are essentially the characteristics that they generally will have, many of which are, modeled or encapsulated like in the state of Oregon's program, for example. So including nearly all beverage containers of all sizes and formats from the outset is really, really important. So states with recycling refunds, many of them list the specific beverages that are in the policy. So for example, in the state of Michigan, they generally are achieving over an 80% redemption rate, so very high recycling rate, but it's only for the beverages that are covered by the deposit. And they only have it applied to carbonated beverages, which in short means that only 52% of the beverages put onto the market are currently covered by the deposit. So the rest of, wine, spirits, bottled water, for example, is not covered, and those have much lower recycling rates in the state of Michigan. So the other piece is having beverage producers being responsible for the program. So very similar to EPR, being able to form their own pro and be able to operate and finance a centralized system themselves versus having a decentralized model, which is what we have in 9 of the 10 states with recycling refunds today. There isn't one consolidated entity outside of the state of Oregon. Making sure that the deposit or the refund value is high enough to incentivize return. Today in the US, that equates to a minimum of 10 cents. It's really important if you want to hit that 90 or even at least 80% plus redemption rate. It's also really important to have minimum redemption rate targets. We prefer 90% because that's tied to our goal, but at least something upwards of 80% is really critical, because that holds the producers responsible to make sure that they're implementing an innovative system that's convenient for consumers, and then they have the incentive to make sure the system is recovering as many beverage containers as possible. And then making sure that unredeemed deposits are actually reinvested and kept within the system is another really important caveat as well. A lot of states actually take the unredeemed deposits and use it to fund other environmental programs at the state level, and for other uses, which might sound great, but having those unredeemed deposits kept within the system helps it continue to innovate. And then speaking of innovation, it's really important to create consumer-driven, convenient return points. So these are a few different examples of what that can look like in the way we think about segmenting the consumer population that might be participating in this program. So in provinces in Canada, such as in British Columbia, you're actually able to think about ways that the two pros, having a pro on EPR and on the recycling refund side, they're actually able to have a lot of synergies between the two programs. So this is an example of a site where you can take your beverage containers for redemption, but they also allow folks to drop off single stream recyclables and other hard to recycle items like batteries, textiles, electronics, appliances, chopsticks even. So thinking about how can you actually have some of those synergies where you can co-locate infrastructure and lead to a very quick way for the consumer to recycle multiple different types of items, and thinking about making it very convenient for them. Also thinking about middle income consumers, having something like a bag drop option where you can have bulk redemption occur within a very short period of time, where you can drop off, hundreds of beverage containers in as little as 30 seconds, and then having that redemption value show up in your digital account, later on in the week, versus having to go to a cashier with your receipt from a reverse vending machine, for example, where you get cash in hand. This would allow it for it to be like an e-transfer, which is becoming more popular, as we know, in the United States. And then it's also really important to think about, thinking about infrastructure. There's a canner or binner population, people who are picking up litter off the street and making sure that beverage containers don't go into the trash because they want that redemption value in hand. So for example, this third picture on the right shows you on-the-go redemption options where you can essentially, if you're walking on the street and you have a can or a bottle, you can donate your beverage container, putting it in one of those caddies on the side of the trash can, then giving some dignity to those folks that are going to be taking that bottle or can and getting that redemption value, versus having to actually dig through the trash and potentially getting injured in that process. And then also providing high volume self-service redemption points where that population can then get that same day cash in hand, which is very important to them. All right, so for our 50 states recycling, we actually did 3 different case studies. I'm only going to dive into one today, but I wanted to give a little bit of an overview in case some of you guys want to go back and read our 200+ page report on this topic. So we did look at the impact of modernizing recycling refunds in the Northeast. So New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, and Maine all have recycling refunds in place, and they all can be improved upon. So we essentially modeled out what would that system look like if it could achieve a 90% redemption rate, and what are the categories, are the ways that the systems would need to be modernized. Then we also looked at both Washington State and the state of Colorado, where we actually modeled out what would the outcomes be of extended producer responsibility policy alone, versus if you kind of have a more high performance recycling policy system where you have both EPR and the recycling refunds on beverage containers, which after all is just a form of EPR for beverage containers that's proven to hit very high recycling rates. And before we dive into Colorado's, I kind of want to talk about what some of these synergies are between the two systems in a very high level way. So when you have a recycling refund program combined with EPR and kind of do this high performance recycling policy together, you're able to achieve much higher recycling rates at a much quicker pace, just because the recycling refund program is actually able to be implemented more quickly than EPR, because you're actually having the pro create and operate their own system. And because you actually have the incentive for consumers to redeem that material to get their money back. The other piece is that because you have the beverage containers being recycled separately in this drop-off type infrastructure, you're enabling much higher levels of closed loop recycling rates. So more bottle-bottle, can-to-can recycling, which would be really beneficial for the state's glass circular economy, for example. You actually also are expanding it beyond just residential. So generally, EPR only applies to residential. While Colorado does have the opportunity to expand it beyond residential, it's going to just start applying to residential in the state of Colorado at the outset. So because the deposit actually applies to all beverage containers, you're expanding access to businesses, schools, parks, and on the go, and other opportunities for all beverage containers in the state to have that redemption value. So we're not just talking about hitting a 90% recycling rate for residential beverage containers, but rather a 90% recycling rate of all beverage containers in the state, whether it's hospitality or in other sectors. You also have that ability to co-develop that infrastructure together to drive efficiency, which is kind of what I alluded to earlier. The fact that you could then have drop-off infrastructure in rural areas for redeeming beverage containers that could also be used to redeem whether it's film or single stream recyclables that are covered in the EPR program. It can really offer up a lot of synergies for the pros to essentially compensate each other for handling those materials. To kind of throw it back to the 1970s and 80s, recycling refunds are the single most effective policy to reduce packaging pollution in our environment. So it's a very effective litter mitigation tool. These programs have up to 84% less littered beverage containers than states without recycling refunds, and it reduces overall litter by up to 65% as well. And then the other important thing to think about is that in a lot of the EPR legislation we're seeing passed, there's a lot of there's notes around expanding or developing reuse and refill infrastructure, which is very hard to do in a single stream recycling system because all the containers are collected and packaging is collected together. It's compressed and then it's sorted through at a MRF. But rather, when you have a reuse and refill system through a recycling refund system, you're enabling that by having the drop-off infrastructure, by having the incentive with a refund in place for the consumer, that then you can actually scale reuse and refill for beverage, but you could even expand it to other non-beverage items that exist in the same system as well. And then the last piece that I'll kind of dive into in the next slide is really by doing these two systems together, you're able to safeguard the current recycling system and protecting and enhancing MRFs and curbside recycling. So as you guys all know, through EPR, you're shifting the financial responsibility of recycling, from ratepayers, jurisdictions, municipalities, et cetera, to the producers, which is really important. And you're providing a stable source of funding because they have to actually fund the full cost of collection, sorting, and recycling those materials. And you're going to have an overall increased throughput because of EPR feeding into that single stream recycling system. And then one thing that's really great too is that essentially whether you have one pro or two, you can make sure that the beverage containers are fairly compensated that are still going through on the MRF system. And then any materials that are handled by the recycling refund system side would also be fairly compensated through producer fees. So making sure that the system remains whole. One thing I also want to emphasize too is that, for example, by pulling the beverage containers out of the MRFs, one, you'll have a cleaner stream for fiber, especially by pulling out the glass. But I want to emphasize too, a lot of what's captured in MRFs today is primarily driven by the market and the commodity, right? So that's one of the reasons why recycling thermoforms has been so challenging, is because PET bottles are have a higher value for the MRFs to capture. Another important thing to note is that a lot of MRFs tend to just capture used beverage cans, and they're neglecting to capture things like aerosols, aluminum foil, pie tins, cat food cans, et cetera, because the alloy mix is different. It doesn't have as much value as a mixed bale of aluminum. So by pulling out the beverage containers to make sure that we're having a closed loop, high closed loop recycling through the recycling refund system, which has higher performance, we're also likely going to see more of those materials actually start to get captured by the MRF because it isn't so heavily relied on just getting the maximum scrap value. I'm trying to think if there's anything else in place. There's also systems where the MRFs can actually also capture potentially part of the redemption value of the beverage containers that are captured as well. It just kind of depends on how the system is set up. Okay. And then this gets into the timeline of implementation that I was mentioning earlier, where essentially the recycling refund program, after the legislation is passed, can actually start collecting material by year 2 or year 3. Whereas EPR, as we all know, has to go through a lot of iterations of doing the needs assessment, fee setting, program plans, many of these other things. And so it really isn't until year 6 at the earliest the EPR starts after the statute is passed. Okay, let's dive into the state of Colorado's findings. Hopefully this video works. So as I mentioned earlier, recycling in Colorado today for packaging is at 11%, and for beverage as well. And then that would go up to 54% for beverage containers. And that under the joint system, what you saw is that actually that would then increase to 95% for beverage containers overall. And so thinking about how these two systems together will actually provide the highest level of performance between the two programs for the state of Colorado overall. Okay. Great. So this essentially shows the difference in the timeline implementation for these policies that I mentioned earlier. So our baseline recycling rate for packaging is at 11% today. Under EPR, 9 years after the legislation is passed, we expect that it would achieve a peak recycling rate of 49%. And then under a joint system, if we were to do recycling refunds coupled with EPR, that would achieve a 66% recycling rate by year 5 and 82% recycling rate by year 9, which would be what we anticipate would be the peak recycling rate. And then for beverage containers specifically, not surprisingly, so 11% today, 54% under EPR, because once again, you have that longer lead time and you don't necessarily have the same incentive for consumers to recycle their beverage containers. But by year 5, we see that under a joint system, you could achieve a 78% recycling rate. And then by year 9, a 95% recycling rate in the state. And then diving into just kind of the cumulative tons, so thinking about what does this look like over a 15-year time horizon. So as I mentioned, overall, Colorado has a 28% recycling rate for everything today. That does include FFP. We anticipate under EPR that would go up to 55%. So that would equate to 6.2 million tons of material recycled over 15 years, which is a 56% increase over baseline. But then under the joint approach, increasing that to 73%, which is 9 million tons recycled over 15 years, or 126% increase over baseline. And then looking at packaging, excluding FFP, 11% recycling rate today, 49% recycling rate under EPR, 2.7 million tons, 197% increase over baseline. But then doing both of these policies together, an 82% recycling rate, 6.3 million tons, and then a 599% increase over baseline. And then the last one for beverage containers, so 11% today, 54% under EPR only, 1.7 million tons of material recovered over 15 years, 171% increase over baseline. But then doing both these policies together, 95% recycling rate, 4 million tons recycled, 558% increase over baseline. So really thinking about doing these two policies together and what the cumulative effect is for recycling is really important as well. And then this looks at climate-related emissions or packaging-related emissions as it relates to climate. So Colorado's 2019 Climate Action Plan aims to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 26% by 2025, 50% by 2030, and 90% by 2050 compared to 2005 levels. And it's really by doing both of these policies together that you see the greatest emission curtailment. So by doing EPR and recycling refunds together, you have a 65% reduction in packaging related emissions compared to current state today. And then this is looking at closed loop recycling. So we do analyze it status quo, EPR and recycling refunds together for PET, glass, and aluminum. But overall, what I want you guys to see here is that today we estimate that only 9% of beverage containers are being recycled in a closed loop in the state of Colorado. We anticipate that that would go up to 33% under EPR, but it would go up to 76% by doing both of these policies together, which is 7 times more than the status quo. So really important to think about as we think about supporting companies like Ball, but also Colorado's local closed loop recycling infrastructure for glass. And then the last piece here is that we also wanted to kind of speak to the economic benefits, environmental and social benefits of recycling as it is today. and what it would be in a future state for the state of Colorado. So the total annual benefits of recycling today is about $460 million, but we anticipate that that would go up to $1.2 billion on an annual basis for the state of Colorado if both of these policies were done together. And just running through conclusions quickly. So this is a snapshot of what closed loop recycling rates look like today in the United States. So for packaging overall, not just beverage. So 5% in the state of Colorado, for example. If somehow nationally we were able to pass, comprehensive recycling policy of doing EPR and recycling refunds together, that map turns from a lot of red to a lot of green. And so, nationally, we estimate essentially there's a 24% recycling rate today, equivalent to $35 billion in annual benefits. So if both of these policies were implemented together, that would equate to $70.3 billion in annual benefits. And for closed loop recycling, it would essentially take beverage containers from 13% to 77% in the United States overall. And I'm happy to pause and answer any questions folks might have. I might need your help, Liz, monitoring the chat and things if there aren't. And if not, that's okay. I know that was an abrupt ending, but.
Well, you have so much to cover. You could go another hour and a half, I'm sure, and hard to know when to stop. I don't see anyone putting anything into the chat or the Q&A. There's such a small group of us here. I'm happy if people just want to raise their hand.
Absolutely. Or I can stop sharing too, just in case.
Put it in the webinar chat. I'm not seeing anything, so while I give people the opportunity to get their thoughts together, I have a couple questions.
Go for it, Liz.
So you talked about several of the recycling refund states are a bit outdated. And what comes to mind for me is the reason they are in decline is because the cost of the amount of the refund does not keep pace with inflation, and so it gets less and less valuable through time. But there's probably more to why systems decline. So could you speak both to why those systems decline and what your research shows that you could do, an entity could do to prevent that when you're designing a new system?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think one thing that's super important, I think, is as these states like Connecticut modernized, for example. But one of the most significant things that Connecticut did was expand the number of beverages that were covered and then increase the deposit to 10 cents. I think what's challenging is that it still didn't enable a pro to jump in to run the system, right? Because there's a lot of entrenched ways. It's very decentralized. There's a lot of mom and pop shops. Retail locations have to have reverse vending machines where you have to manually feed in one beverage container at a time. So essentially in that system, you have to bring all your beverage containers in, you have to feed them into a machine. You have to then get a receipt, assuming that there's no glitches and reading the barcodes or anything, and then take it to a cashier to get your money back, right? In that sort of a system, it takes a lot of time. Like that can take 5, 10, 15 minutes, depending on how many containers you're trying to redeem at one time. And so that also leads to lower participation. So it's the deposit amount, right? It's the number of beverages that are covered, but then also I think the convenience for the consumer is like really preeminent in this. And so that's one of the reasons why you see Oregon doing so well. Maine also has a lot of innovation happening within their system. One thing that's really interesting is that the state of Oregon, when they modernized their bill, I want to say it was back in 2009 or 2007, they actually put a clause in there that if the redemption rate was to drop to, I think, 60%, it actually increased the deposit automatically from 5 to 10 cents. And so that could always be something that's considered. I know that sometimes that's scary, right? Like that legislators or others could view it as like a runaway on increasing the cost to consumers. So I think that's a political battle potentially to fight, but that would be a good safeguard if for some reason the deposit amount was dropping to whatever level that would be, 60% in the case of Oregon. You could have a trigger language in there. But it's super important that all the other components are in there, such as having high redemption targets that producers have to meet, right? That there's a penalty if they do not hit that, but also empowering producers to actually be able to run the system and operate it, so they can continue to innovate, as new technologies come online and whatnot.
One of those new technologies I think you alluded to in terms of being able to get a redemption at your own curb, having a set out. I think that's a model that is only being tried in a few places, but similar to the redemption centers, you are able to put a bag at the curb with your barcode and a truck comes by, picks it up, scans it, and you just, that money gets deposited into your account to make it as
Yeah.
convenient as curbside.
So
Because it is curbside.
Sure. So that the only company that I'm aware of offhand that's doing that is recycle in New York. So essentially, like you forfeit, some of your redemption value for a company to do that for you. But it would be ultimately the most convenient thing for the consumer to do. I mean, obviously, consumers can still put it in their recycle cart, but if they want to get that redemption value back, um, that's kind of one of the cool things about this is it could open up, startups and other things like that to get off the ground in a state like Colorado to provide something similar to what you're describing, Liz.
And I don't want to hog the questions, which I will do because I always have 8 million questions. So I am hesitating to see if anyone wants to ask a question themselves. I don't see anything in the chat. I don't see a raised hand. I will move into my next question with the open invitation for others to chime in. Along the lines of what you just said, in terms of people can still put, if they don't want to bother with a deposit, they can still put containers into their single stream recycling. What I read in the report indicated that you see a dramatic reduction of people doing that while the redemption value is still perceived as significant. Like most people, the majority of people are like, I will get my 10 cents, I will get my 20 cents.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads to the material recovery facilities not getting their value. And you had mentioned it not only improves the value of the other commodities by removing things like glass, which devalue your paper and plastic, but it opens up getting other aluminum into the stream. Can you speak a little bit more to that and the opportunity that creates?
Sure. And it wouldn't just be aluminum either. I would say it would apply for, PET, materials as well, like thermoforms, which has its own recycling initiative too. I think one of the things that the way our system is currently set up, MRFs are, of course, incentivized to capture the materials that have the highest commodity value. But then how that translates is that some of the other materials that might not have as high of commodity value or materials that would downgrade the value of a bale if they were to be mixed in are currently not captured. And so, aerosols is a big thing for us. Those impact extruded bottles are highly recyclable, but then generally, based on the MRFs, like aren't necessarily accepted or based on like the local program. There are concerns around, fires and things, which I think have a lot more to do with lithium ion batteries than it does with, the mousse that makes my hair stand up tall. But that said, there isn't like the incentive right now for those materials to be captured because like the highest value bale is going to be of used beverage cans being, totally separated into its own bale of aluminum. But same sort of thing would apply to a PET bale kind of coming out of a MRF is that if you have the PET bottles pulled out, that might actually increase the other types of PET that are actually able to be recycled through the MRF because the MRF wouldn't just be prioritizing trying to capture things like PET bottles potentially over
I
others.
see. I see. It opens up the market um, and enhances the capture of packaging right now that is not getting captured because it can't compete in the value system with those other
Yeah.
things. We have gotten a question, and the question is, in the beginning of the presentation, you had separated cardboard and plastic film as they
Mhm.
inflate the other numbers. Those plastic films are not residential though, question mark. Those are from store drop off, question mark.
Good question. So the reason why film actually got ended up getting put together with cardboard was also just to kind of keep the data homogeneous from the first report. So in the first report, films were not captured at all, like flexible plastics were not. What we wanted to do for this report is like capture them in there because it is part of the material stream and it is something that producers will be charged for, like in an EPR system. However, all it really did was increase the generation. And then because to your point, it's not captured at the curb, the plastic recycling is de minimis, like it's super small. I think it was like 0% pretty much across the board. So really all it did was we pulled it out to be part of like the overall generation rate. So that's why to some degree, like recycling rates may have dropped in some states, but we also equate that to COVID, some other things that were going on back in 2021. But the fiber piece is really what I was talking about. So that accounts for such a big part of the recycling stream by weight. And because of the commercial sector has such a strong recycling rate for cardboard, and it has like source separated cardboard recycling is pretty pervasive across the US for the commercial sector, that then insulates how the rest of the packaging stream is performing. So that's kind of why capture rate studies and things like that are so important. You can actually see like how many aluminum cans are captured compared to glass bottles, PET bottles, cartons, other types of packaging, polypropylene, versus just assuming that if a municipality says they have a X percentage of a recycling rate, that everything is performing to that level. It's much more likely that the cardboard and everything else is performing at a much higher rate and the rest of packaging is lower. But
And
really good question.
there is another question from Ringa. Hi, Megan and Liz. Referring to the issue of recycling refunds, reducing the value of single stream recycling to MRFs, I understand that was one of the reasons for pushback to recycling refunds in Colorado. How can we address that issue? Sorry if I missed part of the earlier discussion. Thanks.
That's a great question too. I mean, I would say like by having APR in place, a lot of that risk is kind of going to go by the wayside. And the reason why I say that is because you're changing the financial model. So it isn't just based on, processing fees, like tip fees at the MRF coupled with like the scrap value. The producers are actually going to have to cover the full cost of recycling the materials they put onto the market. And so because of that, you're going to make it so that the MRFs don't have to rely so heavily on the beverage containers to make themselves financially whole. So for example, aluminum generally accounts for about 3% of the waste stream for what's processed at a MRF. But in a downed market, it can account for between 20 to 50% of a MRF's revenue. So there has been a very strong financial incentive, to your point, to keep the beverage containers in, mostly aluminum and PET. But with those being pulled out, with EPR in place, the MRFs are going to see increased throughput. We're going to see, residents have access and start recycling across the state of Colorado. So they're going to increase like the number of tons processed with the MRF. So they're not going to be so reliant on the beverage containers. And likely you're still going to have some beverage going through the MRF, which will be fairly compensated through producer fees between the two systems.
And
so hopefully that answered your question, but Liz, please expand on it too.
well, I was going to, I think that answered the question, but you and I have had this discussion before, so Ringa, if that did not answer it, please indicate in the Q&A. What that leads me to is, can you expand on what the other reasons are in Colorado we have not been inclined in the past to pursue a recycling refund here in this state? Obviously the MRF revenue is one of the barriers to proceeding. What are the other barriers?
Yeah, good question. I think in the past, I would say local governments were also fearful, right, of losing that commodity. So I don't want to just blame it on like the haulers and the MRFs, right? It was the full, I'd say like the whole kind of curbside system was fearful of that. Retailers also traditionally have been, opposed to deposits. That doesn't mean that you have to have a return to retail system. Other legislation that's being bandied about in the US, there's discussion around having like leasing agreements between the pro and whoever's hosting like bag drop sites or other locations, make sure that they're fairly compensated. So a grocery store could choose to host a bag drop location in their parking lot, but so could a school or a community center or let's say a landfill that wants to have other recycling drop-offs could do the same thing where they have a drop-off option for beverage containers. So really thinking about kind of diversifying what that can look like, and trying to provide fair compensation, because generally retailers have just been required to do this, but they haven't been fairly compensated to do it. I would also say like it's kind of evolving in the beverage industry as well. I'd say, I think definitely a decade ago, the Ball Corporation was opposed to the deposit legislation too. And I think, a lot of folks in the beverage industry worry about cumbersome, costly programs, kind of like I was describing up in the Northeast or in a state like Michigan, or in Iowa. And so it's really important to make sure that the policy is designed well and that can actually be run by industry to kind of mitigate any of that potential inefficiency that we have kind of seen in other states. I think those are the biggies. And so those are all really big stakeholder groups that would need to be engaged. If Colorado or Recycle Colorado were to start pursuing any sort of stakeholdering process around, recycling refunds, like those groups will all need to be brought to the table to kind of envision like what a new system could look like, especially given that Colorado is going to be on a faster timeline, likely to implement APR, even if recycling refunds were to be passed. So trying to think about like, how do you design a system? How do you ideally build out the correct infrastructure, knowing that you're going to be losing some of the beverage containers to the redemption type of infrastructure versus going through, a typical curbside transfer station MRF infrastructure.
Thank you. And to just encapsulate what you said, what I'm hearing is some of the things that this report and just history over the past 20 years of having recycling refunds in place and watching how that trajectory proceeds, new programs need to be mindful to compensate for revenue loss, whether that's at the MRF level or the local government level, need to make sure that there is flexibility in the collection modality and not a restrictive retail only and all retail forced to do it, and prioritizing the other two things is prioritizing convenience to the consumer and making sure that the producers themselves are the governing or have the largest influence on how the program is implemented. Are those sort of the four elements that seem to need to be in place to move forward in places that haven't previously?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's one of the reasons why you'll see companies like ours advocating for passing EPR and recycling refunds together as a source of like high performance recycling policies, that kind of being the bucket. Is that by doing EPR, you kind of take away a lot of the fear and that risk that curbside recycling programs would face, by just passing recycling refunds on its own.
We have one more question from Hannah Grossberg. She asks, do you know what data the How to Recycle Label program, I'm assuming you are familiar with that program?
I am.
What data the How to Recycle Label program uses for their guidelines? She says, I believe it's based on percentage of MRFs that can process a material, or is it more location based? Would love to hear your thoughts based on the data in this report.
Okay, I think I'm gonna probably need to table that question and circle back. I don't know exactly everything that goes into the How to Recycle guidelines criteria. There is essentially like a way to inventory like how many MRFs and curbside programs, et cetera, accept certain materials. So that ties to consumer recycling access rates for materials, but like that impacts what can go onto a product in terms of its recyclability, like is tied to like the FCC guidelines. But where like what actually like what data informs that label, I will need to circle back.
And I would follow up on that question, which I do not think you have an answer to. But Hannah, that prompts me to want to ask, is anyone tracking the success of the How to Recycle labeling program? Are we, yeah, and I did
Good
not ask
question.
that, Megan, that I think you would know. Um, but I am curious.
Yeah.
Is that it seems like a good idea? Is it actually impacting the recovery rate? Are people actually making use of that tool? I know it's
Mm-hmm.
very new, so it's too soon to know, but I'd be very curious in that, and I imagine other people are also very curious. That is a lot of labeling real estate to give up to
Mm-hmm.
something that does not generate revenue. And
Yeah.
so if I
Good
were in the
point.
position of making labels, I would want to see that it made a difference before I made that investment personally. Ringa also commented that we answered his question. So thank
Oh,
you. Oh,
great.
yeah. And I think we can let you just, yeah, Ringa, if you've got your hand up, would you like to just speak your question?
Hmm.
Yep, he should be able to.
Yeah, hi there, everyone.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, so how to recycle? Yeah, so I've seen very mixed reports on that. A lot of reports say that is an industry, the industry has set it up and it's really a cover for, recycling. It doesn't really work. And personally, I've tried to question how to recycle certain items, and they point me to like go to your Target store and drop it off at the bin which collects the plastic bags or whatever. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really sure how effective that is. I don't know if anybody else has had any experience with that, but I've certainly seen a lot of reports that it doesn't really work the way it's supposed to.
Yeah, I mean that's a fair critique for sure.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Well, I don't see any more questions. Oh, no, Ringa, is that your hand again?
No, I think I didn't take my hand down. Sorry.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Don't want to dismiss people, but I also am happy to give people a couple of minutes back between, I'm sure, the next meeting, um, especially coming in after a holiday. Well, thank you very much. I put a link to the ball report if you would like to dive into yourself into the chat. You can also find it by just going to ball.com, and if you follow the links on their sustainability page or search for 50 states, it is very easy to find. It is not hidden
Awesome.
in any
Well,
way.
thank you guys so much for having me today. This was super fun.
This was great. Thank you, Megan. Very much appreciate it. Thank you for those who have joined us. I see a couple of our folks had to duck out early, but I'm sure they'll catch the recording of this. And thank you so much. This was very informative, and I'm so glad that we captured your insight into this report rather than just the little window we got at the summit earlier this year.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Take care.
You bet. Thanks, everyone.